I'm Clara Beaumont, 42 years old. Last Father's Day, in front of 48 relatives at the family farmhouse, my father slid a $750,000 bill across the table labeled worth of a lifetime failure. Every dime of my childhood braces, school trips, the lot branded as my total waste. He expected tears, the usual begging for mercy. But I attached one dossier. That night, 47 turned their backs on him. The 48th my mother struck far deadlier. Before I unpack that dossier and her silent storm, like if family ever hurt you over money, comment where you're watching from right now, and subscribe for the total collapse. Now come back with me to the moment it all began. Before that table, before the ink dried on that insult masquerading as an invoice, my life was smaller than people imagine when they hear the word analyst. I lived in a narrow brick townhouse 3 blocks from a commuter rail line, the kind that hummed like a held breath every morning at 6. My coffee maker rattled, my laptop fan whined, and my world was spreadsheets and quiet discipline. I built models for clients who wanted certainty where none existed, and I learned to love the math because it never sneered. Numbers didn't remember the tone my father used when he said my name, or the way my brother smirked when I spoke. Numbers stayed honest if you were honest with them. If you're enjoying the calm before the storm, subscribe, because it won't stay calm long. I paid my bills on time. I kept my receipts in labeled folders. I drove a secondhand sedan with a cracked console that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Independence for me wasn't a slogan. It was a habit formed after years of being told I was an expense ledger with legs. My father, Reginald Voss, loved ledgers. He loved them when they proved he was right. When they didn't, he learned how to rewrite them. I learned how to read what was missing. That skill, spotting the gap where truth should be, kept me solvent and quiet. Quiet was safety. Quiet was how I survived family gatherings that felt like audits. Reginald had a voice that filled rooms the way smoke fills a bar, thick, unavoidable, and lingering. He liked to tell stories where he was the hero who paid for everything, the man who invested in futures that disappointed him. He framed generosity as debt. He framed love as interest owed. Nathan, my brother, learned early to echo the laugh at the end of those stories, to nod at the right beats. He was 5 years older, tall where I was compact, confident where I calculated. He learned how to be seen. I learned how to be correct. At family dinners, correctness loses to confidence every time. My mother, Evelyn, Eve to the few who knew her well, had drifted to the edges years ago, like a lighthouse that kept its beam trained outward. She wasn't absent. She was strategic. She asked fewer questions in public and more in private. She listened with the patience of someone who knew silence could be louder than accusation. When people say she was distant, they mean she stopped playing the role assigned to her. She let Reginald take the center while she cataloged exits. I didn't understand that then. I only knew that when Eve looked at me, it felt like being seen without being measured. The farmhouse had always been the stage for our myths. White siding, long table, the smell of roast and cut grass, laughter that turned brittle after the second bottle of wine. I avoided it when I could. Work was my alibi. Distance was my boundary. But I kept a folder, digital, encrypted, and fed over 3 years, because patterns repeat. When a client's books whisper, you listen. When your family's stories rhyme, you prepare. That folder wasn't vengeance. It was hygiene. Clean hands require clean facts. And facts, once assembled, have a gravity all their own. People ask why I didn't confront him earlier, why I didn't set fire to the lies as soon as I smelled smoke. They don't understand leverage. Leverage is timing married to proof. Leverage is knowing when exposure costs more than silence. I watched tuition funds move like shells under cups. I watched invoices bloom and wither. I watched tax forms grow teeth. Each time I took a breath and added another document, another timestamp, another corroboration. If you've ever waited because you knew the truth needed wait, tap subscribe. This is what patience buys. On the surface, my world stayed ordinary. Grocery lists, client calls, late trains, the hum of the city settling into night. Underneath, there was a metronome ticking toward a day I didn't choose but prepared for. Father's Day invitations arrived wrapped in nostalgia and obligation, the kind that dares you to refuse. Nathan texted with forced cheer. Reginald's name sat in my inbox like a summons. I said yes because refusal would have been read as guilt. I said yes because sometimes the only way out is through. I packed light, a neutral dress, flat shoes, and a slim folder that fit inside a laptop sleeve. Not the whole thing, never the whole thing. You don't bring a library when a single page will do. Eve called the night before, her voice steady, her questions precise. She didn't warn me. She didn't ask me to stay home. She asked what time I'd arrive and whether the table still faced the west windows. That was Eve, always checking the angles, always counting exits, the kind of mother who teaches without lecturing. As the train rolled past fields that widened and then narrowed again, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the prelude to being assessed. I reminded myself that assessments can be reversed, that narratives can be audited, that numbers, when laid bare, tell the truth even if voices don't. I stepped onto the platform with a calm I didn't yet understand, carrying a life that had learned how to stand without applause. And that was when I realized the invitation wasn't a celebration at all. It was a trap designed for an audience. The invitation arrived the way bad news often does, dressed as politeness and sent early enough to look thoughtful. A cream envelope, heavy paper, my name centered as if it were a title. Reginald's handwriting hadn't changed in decades. Sharp angles, impatient strokes, every letter leaning forward as though it were late for something more important than me. Inside, a single card. Father's Day, family farmhouse, noon. Attendance appreciated. Appreciated. Not requested, not hoped for. Appreciated, as if my presence were a courtesy he was prepared to acknowledge, not a relationship he intended to honor. I read it twice, then once more, feeling that old familiar pressure settle behind my eyes, the one that said this wasn't about celebration at all. It was about accounting. If you've ever received an invitation that felt like a summons, subscribe, because you already know how this ends. I placed the card on my desk and watched it like it might move on its own. Outside, the commuter train shrieked past, metal on metal, the sound slicing through the morning. My coffee had gone cold. I didn't touch it. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I'd named neutrally, boringly, so no one would ever look twice if they glimpsed it. Archive. 3 years of quiet accumulation stared back at me. Dates, PDFs, scans, spreadsheets cross-checked against public filings and private statements. It wasn't anger that had driven me to collect it. Anger is loud and sloppy. This was instinct sharpened by experience. Every time Reginald spoke about sacrifice, something didn't balance. Every time Nathan laughed along, a number failed to reconcile. You don't ignore that kind of imbalance if you want to survive it. Nathan texted later that afternoon. Can't wait to see everyone together again. It's been too long. There was a smiley face at the end, the kind people use when they want to appear harmless. I stared at it, thumb hovering, then typed something safe. See you Sunday. Safe words for unsafe rooms. Almost immediately, my phone rang. Reginald. I let it ring twice before answering. Not because I wanted to make a point, but because I needed to breathe first. His voice came through strong, practiced, already performing. Clara, glad you got the invitation. We'll finally put some things to rest. Put to rest, as if something were already dead and only needed a marker. I said I'd be there. He said good, and hung up without asking how I was. That was how I knew it mattered to him that I show up. That night, I spread documents across my dining table, the lamplight turning paper edges gold. I didn't review everything, just enough to remind myself what was real. The college fund statement that didn't match the withdrawals, the line items that reappeared under different descriptions, the small loan in my name I'd never authorized, paid just enough to keep it quiet. Each piece alone could be dismissed as error. Together, they told a story Reginald would never allow out loud. I slid the papers back into order and locked them away again. Preparation isn't paranoia when history keeps repeating itself. Eve called the next morning, earlier than usual. Her voice was calm, but there was an alertness beneath it, like someone who'd already smelled smoke. You're going, she said, not asking. Yes, I said. A pause. Then, good. Wear something neutral. Don't carry more than you need. When I asked what she meant, she only said, angles matter. And remember, rooms listen. That was Eve's way. She never told me what to do. She reminded me how to see. The days leading up to Sunday stretched thin. Clients called, deadlines moved, life continued, indifferent to the fact that my family was setting a stage. At night, I dreamed of long tables and empty chairs, of voices echoing without bodies attached to them. On Friday, I printed one document, just one, and slipped it into a slim folder. Not the proof itself, but the map to it. Evidence is more powerful when it promises more than it reveals. If you're still with me, subscribe, because restraint is about to matter more than rage. Sunday morning came with clear skies and the smell of cut grass drifting through open windows as I packed the car. The farmhouse sat an hour and a half away, far enough to feel removed from my daily life, close enough for Reginald to control the narrative. As I drove, my phone buzzed again. Nathan this time. Dad's excited. Says this is an important day. I pictured Reginald rehearsing, testing phrases, deciding where to sit people for maximum effect. He liked audiences. He liked witnesses. What he didn't like was variables. When the farmhouse finally appeared, white against green, cars already lined the drive, I sat for a moment with the engine off. Laughter drifted from the open windows, the familiar sound of family performing happiness. I checked my bag, felt the reassuring flatness of the folder, and thought of Eve's words. Angles matter. I stepped out, gravel crunching under my shoes, and walked toward a house that had never felt like home, knowing the invitation had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had brought me into a room where Reginald believed he still controlled the story. He was wrong, but he didn't know it yet. And that ignorance was the most dangerous thing in the room. The farmhouse smelled exactly the way memory insists it should. Polished wood, roast meat, and a sweetness that came from desserts cooling somewhere out of sight. It was the scent of ritual, of repetition, of a family rehearsing itself year after year. As I crossed the threshold, voices overlapped and then separated, laughter landing in practiced places. 48 relatives meant 48 angles of attention, 48 pairs of eyes that could become mirrors or knives depending on how the afternoon went. Reginald stood at the head of the long table already, not seated, just standing there with a glass in his hand as if the room itself were a pause waiting for his cue. Nathan hovered close, adjusting chairs, greeting people with the easy confidence of someone who believed the script favored him. I felt the familiar tightening at my ribs, then let it pass. If you've ever walked into a room knowing you were the point of it, subscribe, because this is where theater turns to reckoning. Eve arrived moments after I did, unannounced, her presence registering in the room like a shift in air pressure. She wore a simple jacket, neutral tones, nothing that demanded attention, yet people noticed. They always did. She took a seat not beside Reginald, not opposite him, but slightly off to the side, where she could see everyone without being seen as aligned. Angles matter. I took a place halfway down the table, neither hidden nor prominent, my chair scraping softly against the floor. Plates clinked, glasses filled. The sun streamed through the west windows, painting the table in long bands of light and shadow. Reginald waited for the moment when everyone had food and mouths were busy, when interruption would feel rude and compliance would feel polite. He had always loved timing. He cleared his throat. Conversation stalled. 48 people leaned, consciously or not, toward him. He smiled the smile he used for announcements, the one that suggested generosity while preparing a blade. Father's Day, he began, voice steady, carrying. He spoke about family, about sacrifice, about investments made and returns denied. He talked about responsibility as if it were a currency only he understood. Nathan nodded along, eyes flicking occasionally in my direction, a rehearsal of concern that never reached his mouth. I watched hands tighten on forks, saw a cousin glance at her spouse, felt the room grow attentive in that uncomfortable way people do when they sense spectacle approaching, but don't yet know its cost. Reginald turned to me then, the pivot so precise it might have been practiced. Clara, he said, as if my name were a line item he'd finally decided to address. He spoke about children and choices, about support given and gratitude withheld. Each sentence stacked itself into a story where he was the ledger and I was the deficit. I felt heat rise along my neck, not from shame but from recognition. This was the narrative he had always wanted an audience for. He reached down beside his chair and lifted a thick envelope, heavier than paper should be. The room leaned in. With deliberate care, he slid it across the table toward me, the friction loud in the sudden quiet. On the front, in block letters, was the label he'd chosen to crown the moment. Worth of a lifetime failure. The words sat there between us like a dare. Reginald continued, explaining numbers as if teaching a lesson, listing costs he claimed to have borne, braces, trips, tuition, opportunities squandered. He spoke of disappointment with the authority of someone who had never been asked to prove it. The total, he said, came to $750,000. He said it slowly, savoring each syllable, as though the number itself could bruise. A few people gasped. Someone laughed nervously. Nathan smiled, thin and pleased, as if the sum validated something he'd always believed. I didn't touch the envelope. I let it sit. Silence can be a response when words would only decorate cruelty. Reginald waited for tears. He waited for bargaining. He waited for the familiar collapse that had followed smaller humiliations in the past. When none came, his smile tightened. He prodded the envelope closer with a finger, a gesture meant to force participation. "Go on," he said. "You should at least look at it." 48 faces turned toward me, curiosity now fully awake. I felt the room's appetite, the way people lean into humiliation when it isn't theirs. I thought of Eve's voice, calm and precise. I thought of angles. Then I reached into my bag and removed my own slim folder, placing it on the table beside his envelope. Not overlapping, not touching, a parallel line. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. I said, "I brought an attachment." The word landed softly, but it shifted something. Reginald frowned, irritation flickering before he masked it. "An attachment?" he repeated, as if the concept offended him. Nathan leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What is that?" he asked, already certain it was nothing. I slid the folder open and turned it so the title page faced the table. Just one page. Dates, amounts, cross-references, a map without the treasure. "This," I said, "is a summary of discrepancies related to my so-called costs." I didn't list them. I didn't accuse. I named the category and stopped. Reginald laughed, sharp and dismissive. He waved a hand. "You always did love paperwork," he said, to the room. The implication was clear. Pedantry as weakness. He picked up his envelope, tapped it twice, and began to speak again, louder now, pressing the advantage he believed he had. That was when Eve moved. She didn't interrupt. She didn't contradict. She simply reached out and closed Reginald's envelope with 2 fingers, firm but gentle, the way one closes a book mid-sentence. The sound was small, but it cut through the noise like a dropped glass. Reginald stared at her, startled, as if she'd broken an unspoken rule. "We are at a table," Eve said evenly, "not a courtroom." She looked at me then, just for a moment, a look that said, "Proceed only if you choose to." I nodded, once. Reginald sputtered, indignation rising, but the room had shifted. People were watching differently now, less entertained, more alert. I slid the summary page toward the center, not to Reginald, but to the table itself. Anyone close could read the headings: tuition fund variance, unauthorized withdrawals, identity-linked obligations. I still didn't say numbers. I let curiosity do the work. Nathan scoffed, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Dad paid for everything." I met his eyes. "Did he?" I asked quietly. "Or did the account statement say something else?" That was enough. Murmurs spread. A cousin leaned to whisper. An aunt frowned. Reginald's face flushed, color blooming along his cheeks as he reached for control again. He accused me of ingratitude, of manipulation, of trying to ruin a family moment. The words came faster now, less polished. He gestured at the envelope, as if numbers could still rescue him. I finally opened it. Not to read, just to show the audience what theater looked like when stripped of its power. I lifted the top sheet, glanced at it, and set it back down. "Thank you," I said, "for itemizing the story you want remembered." I closed it again and slid it back across to him. The room went very quiet. 48 relatives, breathing together, waiting to see who would speak next. That was when I felt the first true crack, Reginald's certainty faltering as he realized the moment hadn't landed the way he'd planned. Eve didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her stillness was a statement. Reginald tried to laugh it off, but the laughter didn't catch. Nathan shifted in his chair, glancing around, gauging loyalty. A few people avoided his eyes. Others stared openly at the summary page, as if it might explain more than it showed. I gathered my folder, slid it back into my bag, and stood. Not to leave, yet, but to change the geometry of the room. I said only this: "I won't discuss this here. Anyone with questions knows how to reach me." Then I sat back down. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Conversations restarted in fragments, but they were different now, edged with suspicion. Reginald drank too quickly. Nathan whispered, urgently, to a cousin who shrugged him off. 48 people had come for a meal and found themselves inside a ledger they couldn't unsee. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not triumph, not relief. Clarity. The envelope lay where it had always belonged, exposed as a prop. The attachment had done its job by existing. As plates were cleared and dessert approached, Reginald leaned toward me, voice low and sharp. You think this is over, he hissed. I met his gaze and said nothing. Because it wasn't over. It was only balanced enough to tip. And as I felt Eve's presence steady at my side, I realized this confrontation was merely the opening act, and the deadliest move hadn't even been made yet. Dessert arrived the way conclusions often do. Too sweet, too late, and meant to distract. Plates slid onto the table with forced cheer, forks clinked, and someone joked about calories as if humor could rewind the last 10 minutes. Reginald accepted a slice he didn't want and cut it without eating, his knife tracing lines through frosting as if rehearsing a rebuttal. Nathan leaned back, arms crossed, scanning faces for allegiance and finding less of it than he expected. I stayed still. Stillness after disruption unsettles people more than shouting ever could. If you're still here, subscribe, because restraint is about to expose what noise cannot. The first question came from an aunt who'd always been kind to me in quiet ways. She didn't ask it out loud. She leaned in and murmured, almost apologetic, "What discrepancies?" I didn't answer with a speech. I answered by standing again, not to command attention, but to make a choice visible. I said, I brought one attachment for anyone who wants context. I didn't pass papers. I passed a single card with a secure link and a time window. 24 hours, view only. No downloads. Evidence is strongest when it can't be twisted. Reginald's jaw tightened. Nathan scoffed, too loudly. The aunt took the card, eyes steady, and nodded once. The link went live at precisely 12:43. I know because my watch vibrated, the softest confirmation that preparation had met its moment. It wasn't the whole archive. It was the first anvil. A summary dashboard, plain and readable, with footnotes that pointed outward to verifiable sources. Tuition fund contributions versus withdrawals. Dates aligned. Totals reconciled. No adjectives. No accusations. Just math doing what math does when you stop lying to it. I didn't announce it. I let curiosity carry it across the table. Phones appeared, brows furrowed. A cousin's fork paused midair. Someone cleared their throat and didn't finish the thought. Reginald stood. Chairs scraped as if the room were bracing. "This is inappropriate," he said, voice rising to reclaim the ceiling. "We're not doing this here." He gestured at me as if I were a mess to be cleaned. I met his volume with calm. "I agree," I said. "Which is why it's view only and temporary. Transparency doesn't require theatrics. It requires access." The word access landed hard. Nathan laughed again, but it cracked halfway through, a sound that betrayed calculation. "You always did like to control the frame," he said. I looked at him. "Control the frame?" I replied. "Or correct it?" Eve hadn't moved. She watched Reginald with the patience of someone timing a tide. When he tried to speak again, she lifted her hand. Not high, not dramatic, just enough. He stopped. The room noticed. Eve addressed the table. Not him. "We're guests in a shared space," she said. "No one is on trial. But facts don't disappear because they're inconvenient. If anyone would rather not look, don't. If anyone wants clarity, it's available." Then she sat back. The authority wasn't loud. It was earned. Phones buzzed with the vibration of cognition. A cousin whispered, "This can't be right." Another murmured, "It matches the statements from 2 years ago." Reginald's face reddened, then paled. He reached for the envelope again, as if heft alone could restore gravity. He opened it and read, finally read, as if the ink might have changed. It hadn't. His story had been built to perform, not to withstand inspection. He tried a new tack, confusion. He spoke of clerical errors, of advisors who'd handled details, of intent misunderstood. I let him. Explanations are easier to dismantle when they overproduce themselves. Nathan stepped in. Louder. Sharper. "You're implying theft," he said, eyes flashing. "Say it." I shook my head. "I'm implying arithmetic," I said. "Theft is a conclusion. Arithmetic is a process." The room exhaled. Someone laughed, short and surprised. The dashboard refreshed automatically at 12:50, highlighting reconciled totals and footnotes. I hadn't planned the timing to be theatrical, but truth has a sense of rhythm when you let it breathe. A cousin asked, "What about the small loan?" The question hung there, precise and dangerous. Reginald froze. Nathan looked at him, then away. I answered carefully. "That's not in the first attachment," I said. "That's context for later, if needed. You don't detonate everything at once. You let people choose whether they want the next page." Reginald slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking through porcelain. "Enough!" he barked. This is my house, my rules. The word my echoed, hollow. Eve met his eyes. Houses, she said, don't make rules. People do, and people can change them. The 24-hour window ticked on. I could feel it, like a second heartbeat. Phones continued to appear and disappear, glances exchanged, narratives recalculated. A few relatives pushed back their chairs and stepped outside. Air needed, recalibration required. Reginald's confidence bled away in increments, each minute another drop. Nathan tried to corral allies, whispering, gesturing, offering certainty. He found less of it with every circuit of the table. The audience had become readers, and readers are harder to bully. I stayed seated, hands folded, posture neutral. Performance had been Reginald's choice, not mine. When he accused me again, ingratitude, betrayal, I responded once and only once. Gratitude, I said, doesn't require amnesia. Betrayal doesn't begin with documentation. It begins with misuse of trust. The words were soft. The effect was not. Someone pushed dessert away untouched. Another asked Eve a question in a low voice. She answered without looking at Reginald. At 12:58, the dashboard logged its highest view count. I didn't announce it. I watched Reginald watch others, his power draining as he realized the room no longer needed him to interpret reality. He tried to regain footing by proposing a private discussion. Later, he said. We'll settle this later. I nodded. Later is fine, I said. Facts don't expire at sunset. The window will close when it closes. The implication was clear. There would be a record of who chose to look and who chose not to. When the clock struck 1:07, the link expired. Screens went dark. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. Reginald stared at his hands as if they had failed him. Nathan swallowed and said nothing. I felt the first tremor of something like relief, not because it was over, but because it had begun to move on its own. Momentum is a force once you release it. If you're still with me, subscribe, because the next attachment doesn't ask permission. I gathered my bag and stood again, not to leave, but to reset. Thank you for your time, I said to the table. Anyone who wants clarification can reach me. Then I turned to Reginald. We'll talk when you're ready to listen. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The words had lost their purchase. Eve rose with me, placed a hand briefly at my back, support without spectacle, and together we stepped away from the table. Behind us, 48 relatives recalibrated their understanding of the man at the head of it. Outside, the air was cool and smelled of cut grass. I breathed in, steady. Inside, voices rose and fell, uncertain. The first anvil had landed. It hadn't crushed him. It didn't need to. It had cracked the foundation. And as I felt my phone vibrate with a single message from a number I didn't recognize, 3 words only, we have questions, I understood that the real ordeal was about to begin. The questions didn't arrive like accusations. They arrived like confirmations, careful and measured, the way professionals speak when they already suspect the answer. My phone buzzed again as Eve and I stood outside, the farmhouse windows glowing behind us like a set after the curtain drops. We have questions, the message repeated from a second number, then a third. No names yet, just gravity. Momentum had found its feet. If you're following this, subscribe, because this is where truth stops being solitary and starts choosing sides. Eve and I didn't leave immediately. That mattered. Walking away would have looked like victory laps, and I wasn't interested in theater anymore. We took a slow path along the edge of the yard where old fence posts leaned and the cicadas tuned themselves for evening. Eve spoke first, voice low. They'll split, she said. Not today, but soon. When people discover certainty was rented, not owned, they shop for a new landlord. I nodded. Inside, voices rose, then fell, then fractured into clusters. A family dividing itself sounds like weather changing. By the time we returned indoors, the room had reorganized. Chairs were angled differently. Alliances had loosened. Reginald stood near the sink with a drink he hadn't touched, staring through a window as if answers might be written on the glass. Nathan paced, performing concern for anyone who would accept it. A cousin approached me, not the kind one, a pragmatic one. She asked if there was more. I answered with a question of my own. What would you want to know first? She didn't hesitate. The college fund. That told me everything. I shared the second attachment with 3 people only, chosen not for loyalty, but for reach. The access window was shorter this time, 12 minutes. The dashboard was denser, still plain, still annotated. It showed the transfer that never reached the university account, the detour that reappeared months later under a different vendor name, the memo fields that tried and failed to disguise intent. I watched faces change as numbers aligned. This wasn't shock. It was recognition. One of them whispered, "That explains the letter she never got." The room inhaled together. Reginald turned, sensing the shift without understanding its source. He demanded to know what was being shown. I didn't answer him. I answered the table. "The second attachment clarifies one discrepancy," I said. "It doesn't conclude anything by itself. Conclusions belong to readers." The word readers again. Nathan snapped that this was harassment, that I was poisoning people. Eve spoke then, quiet and precise. "Poison relies on secrecy," she said. "This relies on receipts. The distinction matters." Phones went dark as the window closed. The 12 minutes ended. The silence afterward was different from before, thicker, heavier, laced with choice. A few people stepped away from Reginald, not dramatically, just a chair scoot here, a turned shoulder there. Social gravity reassigns itself in small increments. Nathan noticed and tried to pull it back with jokes, with reminders of shared history. It didn't work. History had just been footnoted. I didn't intend to share the third attachment that day. Escalation is dangerous when you confuse it with momentum. But momentum has its own ethics. A man I barely knew, an uncle by marriage, practical eyes, asked one sentence that changed the calculus. Are there liabilities tied to her identity? He didn't look at Reginald when he said it. He looked at me. I weighed the room, Eve's stillness, the way Reginald's hand trembled on his glass. I nodded once. There are. The third attachment went live to a single screen, mirrored to the television at the far end of the room at the request of someone I trusted to read silently. 10 minutes, no screenshots. The dashboard opened with a disclaimer about scope and verification, then showed the small loan, the timing, the signature mismatch, the payments designed to avoid attention. Identity-linked obligations don't announce themselves. They erode. Gasps this time. Not loud. Controlled. The kind that says people are recalculating their past conversations. Nathan swore under his breath. Reginald went very still. "You're accusing me," Reginald said, voice thin. I shook my head. "I'm documenting patterns," I said. "Accusations belong to conclusions. Conclusions belong to those who read." Someone turned the television off as the window closed. The silence pressed in. A cousin asked Eve if she knew. Eve answered without hesitation. "I knew enough to ask better questions," she said. That's what parents are for. The word parents landed like a rebuke that didn't need volume. The split became visible then, not half and half, more like a fracture line that ran through assumptions rather than people. Those who'd benefited from Reginald's certainty hovered close to him, defensive, brittle. Those who'd been overlooked or confused drifted toward light, toward clarity. Nathan tried one last time to rally. He accused me of ambition, of envy, of wanting the inheritance. I laughed once, surprised by it. If I wanted money, I said, I wouldn't start by auditing the room. Eve placed a folded paper beside Reginald's glass. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew her handwriting. His face changed, not to fear exactly, but to calculation under duress. He looked at Nathan, then at me, then at the table that no longer mirrored him. The folded paper stayed folded. Eve had always believed in timing. The conversations that followed were quieter, more surgical. People asked me for copies later, for guidance on how to read what they'd seen. I gave boundaries instead of answers. Tomorrow, I said, context matters. Tonight is for digestion. If you're still with me, subscribe, because digestion is about to turn into consequence. As dusk settled, Reginald announced we were done for the day, a declaration that fell flat. People left in small groups, murmuring, phones lighting up the driveway. Nathan lingered, torn between loyalty and survival. He said my name once, softer. I met his eyes and said nothing. Silence is sometimes the only boundary that sticks. When only a handful remained, Eve touched my arm. Time, she said. We gathered our things. At the door, Reginald finally spoke to me without performance. You think you've won, he said. I looked past him at the table, the chairs misaligned, the story in pieces. This isn't winning, I said. It's accounting. We stepped outside into the cooling air. My phone buzzed again, then again. Different numbers, different questions, partners, advisors, A reporter who didn't identify themselves but asked about timelines. Eve glanced at the screen and nodded once. The room had done its work. The audience had become a network. And as we walked toward the car, I realized the escalation had reached a point where my role would soon diminish, because the deadliest move wasn't mine to make. Night pressed in around the farmhouse with the weight of inevitability, the kind that makes even familiar walls feel like witnesses. Eve drove. I watched the road unwind in the headlights, my phone face down in my lap, vibrating at irregular intervals like a second pulse I didn't quite trust yet. The ordeal wasn't the confrontation at the table. That had been theater. The ordeal was this stretch of time when lies, exposed to air, start scrambling for oxygen. If you've ever known the truth would cost more before it paid back, subscribe, because this is the price. By the time we reached the city, messages had multiplied and sharpened. Advisors asking for documentation chains, partners requesting clarification calls, one journalist asking whether the discrepancies involved personal misuse or corporate governance. I didn't answer immediately. Eve poured water, not wine. We sat at my small kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the spaces between us. She looked older under the harsh light, not tired, resolved. "It's time," she said, not asking. I nodded. The folded paper she'd placed beside Reginald's glass came back to me like a key you don't realize you're holding until the lock appears. Eve opened her own laptop. I'd never seen her move with that kind of speed. Tabs bloomed across the screen. Accounts, timelines, communications, an archive parallel to mine, cleaner, colder, and devastating in its restraint. I understood then what she'd meant by distance all those years. She hadn't been absent. She'd been gathering. Reginald's affairs weren't scandal. They were leverage because of the money trails attached to them. Discretionary funds routed through shell expenses, gifts booked as consulting, trips itemized as retreats. Eve hadn't collected gossip. She'd collected proof. The calls began. Eve answered the first on speaker, voice steady, offering nothing beyond confirmation and access parameters. She didn't accuse. She authenticated. By midnight, 3 partners had frozen discretionary spending pending review. By 1 a.m, an auditor requested temporary holds. Eve forwarded without comment. Nathan tried to call me twice. I didn't answer. Reginald sent a single message that said, "This ends now." It didn't. The ordeal tightened at dawn. News travels faster when it doesn't have to be sensational. A quiet inquiry becomes a pause. A pause becomes a freeze. Eve sent the packet anonymously to 2 outlets known for restraint, not outrage, the kind that let documents speak. The subject line was boring on purpose. Governance questions. The body was cleaner than anything I'd ever written. No adjectives, just dates and discrepancies. This wasn't revenge. It was exposure calibrated to do maximum work with minimum noise. Reginald arrived at my door mid-morning without calling, fury and panic misaligned on his face. Nathan followed, pale, eyes darting. Reginald tried command first, then bargaining, then the old familiar accusation that I was destroying the family. I listened until he ran out of air. Then I spoke once. "You billed me for a lifetime," I said. "She audited yours." Nathan flinched. Reginald reached for Eve, then stopped, understanding too late that she wasn't in the room to be appealed to. She was everywhere else. The ordeal broke him not in a shout, but in a sentence. He admitted a misunderstanding, then corrected himself to mismanagement, then blamed advisors he'd handpicked. Each revision shrank him. Nathan tried to salvage something: inheritance, reputation, a timeline that spared them. Eve's email chimed on my laptop as if on cue. Temporary power of attorney acknowledged. Effective immediately. The words settled like dust after demolition. Reginald stared at the screen, comprehension arriving too slowly to save him. "You can't," he said. "Eve can," I replied. "She already did." He looked at me then, truly looked, and for the first time I saw fear without costume. The ordeal had done its work. The lies had nowhere left to stand. As they left, Reginald stiff, Nathan hollow, I felt the weight lift and settle somewhere else entirely. Because the storm Eve had released wasn't finished yet, and the deadliest consequence was about to land where neither of them could hide. The aftermath didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. It arrived with emails that used words like pending and provisional, with calendars suddenly full of meetings that no longer included Reginald's name. Eve understood something I was still learning in real time. The most effective consequences don't announce themselves. They simply rearrange reality until the old version can't be restored. If you've stayed with me this far, subscribe, because this is the moment the quiet work becomes irreversible. Eve didn't celebrate. She brewed tea and opened her notebook, the one with margins worn thin from years of annotations. She explained the sequence without drama. The anonymous packets had gone to partners first, not media, because freezes required discretion to hold. The media came second, chosen for patience, not appetite. The language stayed technical, not moral. Governance failures, fiduciary concerns, patterned discrepancies. She'd learned long ago that outrage exhausts people, clarity mobilizes them. Reginald's world didn't collapse in a day. It narrowed. Doors stayed closed a little longer. Calls went unanswered. The radius of his authority shrank to the size of his excuses. The first public mention appeared midweek, buried on page 6 of a trade outlet most people never read. That was enough. A footnote can do what a headline cannot when the right readers notice. By Friday, a second outlet confirmed independent review. Reginald tried to spin it as routine. Nathan tried to frame it as envy. Neither story survived contact with the documents. Eve watched it unfold the way gardeners watch weather. Alert, patient, hands clean. Then came the part she hadn't shared with me until it was already done. The power of attorney wasn't merely temporary. It was layered, contingent on triggers Reginald had tripped himself years earlier and forgotten. Eve had kept the keys because she'd been written out socially, not legally. She'd preserved the quiet authority that accumulates when someone underestimates you. The transfer didn't look like punishment. It looked like housekeeping. Assets consolidated, accounts stabilized, beneficiaries clarified. The word clarified did a lot of work. Nathan called late, voice small. He asked what he could do. I told him the truth. You can stop defending a story that's been audited. He didn't argue. He asked about his future. I said futures are easier to build when you stop borrowing from lies. He hung up without anger, only fatigue. Reginald didn't call again. He sent a letter instead. Paper, formal, careful, requesting mediation. Eve read it once and filed it without comment. Mediation requires leverage. He had none left. The deadliest move landed quietly the following Monday. A notice, procedural and precise, informed partners of a governance restructure and named me as interim beneficiary under Eve's authority, limited and reviewable, designed to protect value during uncertainty. It wasn't triumph, it was responsibility. I felt the weight of it settle like a mantle I hadn't sought but wouldn't drop. People assume revenge looks like joy. This looked like work. Eve watched my face as I read. You don't have to keep it, she said. This is about safety, not ownership. I nodded. Safety first, always. The inheritance wasn't a trophy. It was insulation, against retaliation, against narrative reversal, against the familiar attempt to make me small again. Reginald learned what it means when the audience changes and the ledgers stop lying for you. The call slowed, the questions sharpened. The network did what networks do. Verified, contained, reallocated. Reginald's social capital evaporated faster than his money. That was the part people don't understand. Reputation isn't destroyed by scandal, it's destroyed by corroboration. Eve's storm had passed, leaving a landscape where only sturdy structures remained. One evening, as the city settled into a hum I recognized again, Eve stood by my window and looked out at the trains. I thought you'd need proof, she said. I didn't know you'd need protection. I told her she'd given me both. She smiled, the smallest curve of it. Mothers learn to strike where the noise won't reach, she said. That's how you keep children alive. I went to bed that night knowing the worst was over and the most consequential part had begun. Because resolution isn't the end of a story like this. It's the moment you choose what to build on the cleared ground. And as I closed my eyes, one final message lit my phone. Brief, verified, and impossible to ignore, confirming that the last hold had become permanent, and the fallout would reach further than any of us had planned. The weeks that followed didn't feel like victory. They felt like quiet repairs, the kind you make after a storm when the air is clear, but the ground is still soft. I returned to my routines with a difference I couldn't immediately name. The train still hummed at 6. My coffee maker still rattled. Clients still wanted certainty where none existed. But the background noise, the old hum of being measured and found wanting, was gone. In its place was something steadier, the knowledge that the story had been audited and closed. If this resonates with you, subscribe, because endings like this are built, not given. Reginald receded the way power often does when it's finally confronted by documentation. Not loudly, not dramatically. His name stopped appearing on agendas. Invitations dried up. Calls went unanswered. He existed now in the margins, where footnotes live when the main text moves on. Nathan took a job in another city, quieter, less visible. We spoke once, briefly. He didn't apologize. He didn't accuse. He asked how to start over. I told him the truth I'd learned too late to teach him earlier. You start by telling the truth even when no one is listening yet. The inheritance stabilized into something less symbolic and more practical. Trusts reviewed, assets protected. I kept my role narrow and temporary, exactly as Eve intended. Power that arrives without desire is easier to release when its work is done. I didn't buy anything extravagant. I didn't move. I paid off obligations I'd never chosen and set aside what would protect my future from anyone else's mythology. Money didn't make me larger, it made me quieter. That was the gift. Eve stayed close for a while, then stepped back again, her preferred distance. One evening, we walked along the tracks as the sun dipped and trains stitched the horizon together. She told me what she'd learned too late herself, that silence is a weapon only when you choose it, and a wound when it's forced on you. She hadn't been distant to survive Reginald. She'd been distant to survive herself. We laughed softly at the symmetry of it. Two women learning different versions of the same lesson from opposite ends of the same table. I thought often about the relatives, about the way a room can change when people are invited to read for themselves. No one apologized publicly. No one needed to. The recalibration was enough. Families don't heal with declarations. They heal with boundaries that hold. The ledger closed not with forgiveness or punishment, but with accuracy. That mattered more than I'd expected. Work took on a new texture. When clients asked how to handle partners who dominated narratives, I spoke less about strategy and more about documentation. Stories are persuasive, I told them. Records are final. Some listened, some didn't. The ones who did slept better. So did I. On the anniversary of that Father's Day, I didn't return to the farmhouse. I spent the afternoon in my small kitchen, windows open, the city breathing around me. I made a simple meal. I wrote Eve a note, not an email, a note, thanking her for teaching me where to stand so the truth could be seen. She wrote back with one line, "Angles matter. Always." If there's a lesson here, it isn't about money or inheritance or even revenge. It's about refusing to carry a balance sheet someone else invented for you. It's about understanding that humiliation only works when it goes unanswered, and that answers don't have to be loud to be lethal. It's about mothers who protect without spectacle, and daughters who learn to read what's missing. If family ever hurt you over money, power, or silence, you're not alone. Tell me where you're watching from, and if this story gave you clarity or courage, subscribe. Not for collapse, but for what comes after, when the numbers finally tell the truth and the quiet belongs to you again.